What we're talking about today is the absolute meltdown happening in Trump's world right now over impeachment articles. I've been laughing about this all week. Here's what's wild. These aren't just some Democrats trying to get headlines anymore. We're talking about actual formal articles of impeachment being filed in the House of Representatives, one after another, with specific charges and constitutional arguments that are starting to make people wake up and pay attention. And Trump's people are panicking. When you're this defensive about something, when you're this aggressive in your denials, it usually means something's really bothering you. Let me set the scene so you understand exactly what's going on. Back in April, Michigan Congressman Sri Thanedar, a real member of Congress, goes on the House floor and files 7 articles of impeachment against Donald Trump. 7 formal charges: obstruction of justice, usurpation of congressional authority, abuse of emergency powers, violations of First Amendment rights, creation of unlawful offices like the Department of Government Efficiency, and bribery and corruption charges. This is comprehensive, detailed, not some throwaway political stunt. Thanedar is looking directly at Trump and saying, "You're unfit to serve as president. You represent a clear and present danger to our Constitution and our democracy." At first, Democratic leadership kind of pretended this wasn't happening. They didn't want to engage with it. But here's where it gets interesting. Less than a month later, Houston Congressman Al Green, who's got a whole history of this stuff, who literally heckled Trump during a joint address to Congress and got himself removed and censured by his colleagues, files his own impeachment articles. Then in November, Al Green announces he's going to file more articles of impeachment, specifically pledging to do it before Christmas. We're living through a moment where multiple sitting members of Congress are independently deciding that impeachment is necessary before the president leaves for the holidays. That tells you something about where we are as a country right now. So what happens after this? The Trump administration goes ballistic. They're sending out statements saying every action Trump takes is lawful and rooted in the will of the American people. They're calling these impeachment efforts desperate political stunts that Americans see right through. But here's what gets me. They're not actually defending Trump on the merits. They're not saying, no, he didn't do these things. They're just attacking the people filing the articles and saying it's all political theater. When you can't defend what you actually did, you attack the people doing the criticizing. That's basic stuff, but it works on a lot of people, but not everyone. Some people are paying attention like you're doing right now. The most interesting part is what happened with Thanedar after he filed those 7 articles. He comes under enormous pressure from Democratic leadership. They're calling him up, talking to him behind closed doors. Pretty soon, he pulls back. He says he wants to add more articles, get more input from colleagues, but basically, he backs off from forcing a vote. Democratic leadership made it clear. We don't want this right now. We're worried it'll hurt us politically. We've got other things we want to focus on. So Thanedar steps back. But the very fact that Democratic leaders had to pressure him shows that there are real members of Congress, including a brand new member who was just elected, who genuinely believe Trump has committed offenses that warrant removal from office. Now, Al Green is different. He's got a history of going his own way. He doesn't care what leadership says. He got censured by Congress after heckling Trump, but he became a hero to many Democrats for doing it. So when Green decides he's filing impeachment articles and then decides he's going to file more before Christmas, he's serious. He's not taking orders. He's not afraid of the political fallout. He's looking at Trump and saying, this is an authoritarian. This is a threat to democracy. We need to do something about it. And what's wild is that more than 500,000 Americans signed a petition by the Free Speech for People organization calling for impeachment. 500,000 Americans saying, we agree with Al Green. We think Trump should be impeached. The charges in these articles are not frivolous. They're not random accusations. They connect directly to actual constitutional crises we've been watching all year. The charge about abuse of trade powers, that's about emergency tariffs that have already been challenged in court, where lower court judges have basically said Trump overstepped his authority. The charge about usurpation of congressional authority over spending, that's about Trump redirecting money that Congress appropriated for one thing to be used for something else entirely without asking Congress. The charge about abuse of emergency powers, that's about all the different ways Trump's used emergency declarations to bypass normal governmental procedures. These aren't made-up charges. They're connected to things that actually happened. Then there are the newer charges that Al Green is including about military action. In June, Trump announced attacks on Iranian nuclear sites, Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan, without going through Congress first, without getting congressional authorization, without even properly briefing congressional leadership beforehand. He just announced it on Truth Social, and boom, military strikes happen. The Constitution is pretty clear about this. Only Congress can declare war. The president is commander-in-chief, but he doesn't get to unilaterally launch military operations without congressional approval. Green is citing this as an abuse of power that facilitates authoritarianism. And you know what? He's got a point there. What's gotten lost in all of this, what the mainstream media doesn't spend enough time talking about, is that many of these articles are using the word authoritarianism explicitly. That's not politics as usual. That's not just partisan back and forth. That's members of Congress formally charging that the president is moving the country toward autocratic rule. That's them saying he's consolidating power in dangerous ways, attacking the judiciary, defying court orders, trying to make himself above the law. Whether you agree with that assessment or not, that's what these formal charges say. That's the record. Now, I want to be clear about something. Is impeachment going to go anywhere? Probably not. Republicans control the House. You need a majority to impeach, and then 2/3 of the Senate to actually convict and remove. With Republicans in charge of both chambers, that's not happening. Trump's base isn't going to abandon him. Most Republican senators are going to stick with him. So from a practical standpoint, these impeachment efforts are probably dead on arrival, but that doesn't mean they don't matter. They create a formal record. They put people on the record. They force the question, what are the limits of presidential power? When do we say enough is enough? When do we actually use the tools the Constitution gives us to check a president? Here's what I find fascinating about watching all this, and this is where I've got to laugh a little bit, how defensive Trump's people get about it. You'd think if they were confident in their legal position, they'd just be like, yeah, whatever, it's never going to pass. But instead, they're aggressive, angry, attacking the people filing the articles. They're using words like witch hunt and political theater. They're saying it's a desperate stunt that Americans see right through. But the truth is, it's working on some people. 50% of Americans have heard about these impeachment efforts. They're not forgotten. They're not just some inside baseball thing that Washington insiders talk about. Real people are hearing about it, thinking about it, forming opinions about it. That's real power, even if impeachment never passes. What's interesting from a political standpoint is the split within the Democratic Party about all this. You've got the progressive wing saying, we got to do this. It's a constitutional duty. We can't just sit on our hands while a president dismantles democracy. History will judge us for it. And then you've got the more moderate wing saying, look, this is a political trap. It's not going to work. It's going to backfire on us. We need to focus on elections and let the voters decide. That's a real tension. That's a genuine strategic disagreement about how to respond to Trump's presidency. And it's playing out in real time with guys like Thanedar backing off and guys like Green doubling down. The one thing all these impeachment efforts have in common is that they're happening because real members of Congress believe Trump has gone too far. They're not doing this for attention or headlines. Most of these guys would probably prefer to be doing other things, but they look at what's happening in Washington, they look at the courts ruling against Trump's actions, they look at the way he's consolidating power, they look at the attacks on the judiciary, and they go, we have to act. That's conviction. That's principle. You can disagree with whether impeachment is the right response, but you can't say these members are doing it for trivial reasons. Look, I know impeachment talk can feel distant and abstract. It's Congress, it's constitutional law, it's political theater, but underneath all of it, there's a real question being asked in America. Is anyone above the law? Is there a real check on presidential power, or is it just whatever the current president decides to do? Can Congress actually use the tools it has to restrain a president who's abusing power, or is impeachment just a symbolic exercise that never actually removes anyone from office? These aren't small questions. They go to the heart of how our government is supposed to work. They go to the heart of democracy itself. And when you've got guys like Al Green willing to stand up in Congress and say, yes, we're going to pursue this despite the political cost, that matters. That's important. That's worth paying attention to. The 6th and 7th articles address bribery and corruption. These charges allege that Trump has used his office for personal enrichment, that he's accepted benefits that violate constitutional prohibitions on emoluments. The founders were deeply worried about presidents being corrupted by foreign or domestic interests. So they put a clause in the Constitution saying the president can't accept gifts or benefits from foreign governments or domestic interests without congressional approval. The charges say Trump has violated this. Taken all together, what do these articles paint a picture of? A president who sees the rules and procedures of government as obstacles to be overcome rather than constraints that he needs to respect. A president who's consolidating power, taking authority that belongs to Congress, attacking people who criticize him, and allegedly enriching himself in the process. Whether you think those charges are accurate or justified, that's what's being alleged by sitting members of Congress. That's the formal accusation. And here's what gets me about this. These charges aren't vague. They're not just Trump being a bad guy. They're constitutional violations. They're specific actions that allegedly violate specific parts of the Constitution. They're documented. They're cited. Courts have already ruled on some of them. So when the Trump administration says this is all a political stunt and Democrats are just being partisan, they're not actually engaging with the substance of the charges. They're just dismissing them. They're not explaining why these aren't constitutional violations. They're not defending Trump's actions on the merits. They're just saying it's politics and it won't go anywhere. Al Green's articles add another layer to this. He's focusing on the authoritarianism angle. He's saying Trump is turning America into an autocracy. He's pointing to Trump's attacks on the judiciary, his military actions without congressional authorization, his attempts to consolidate power. He's putting a name to the pattern. He's saying this isn't just Trump being Trump, doing Trump things. This is Trump systematically dismantling democratic institutions and moving the country toward authoritarian rule. That's the charge. That's what's being formally alleged. Now, is this going to succeed? No. Republicans control both chambers of Congress, but that doesn't mean the charges are meaningless. That doesn't mean they're just political theater. What it means is that the impeachment efforts are happening in a context where they probably won't lead to removal, but they might lead to something else. They might lead to public understanding of what Trump's actually doing. They might shift public opinion. They might create political pressure that leads to investigations or other consequences. They might prepare the ground for something bigger if circumstances change. They might inspire people to vote differently in 2026. There are a lot of things they might do besides actually remove Trump from office, and that's what's driving the panic. Trump's people know that impeachment probably won't succeed, but they also know that these articles, once they're filed, once they're in the public record, once people understand what the charges are, it changes the conversation. It puts Trump on the defensive. It forces Republicans to choose whether they're going to defend these actions or distance themselves from them. It creates a narrative where Trump's the guy Congress had to impeach, even if impeachment doesn't work. And that narrative is powerful. That narrative matters. That's what's got them worried. So let's talk about the political dynamics here, because this is where it gets really interesting from a strategic standpoint. You've got different wings of the Democratic Party wanting different things. You've got outside activist groups pushing for action. You've got Republicans circling the wagons. You've got the mainstream media trying to decide whether this is serious or just political theater. And all of it's happening while Trump is in office, while he still has power, while he can shape the narrative. That's the environment we're in right now. On one side, you've got progressives like Thanedar and Green who believe impeachment is a constitutional duty regardless of whether it can succeed politically. Their argument is simple. If the president has committed high crimes and misdemeanors, Congress has an obligation to impeach him. It doesn't matter if the Senate won't convict. It doesn't matter if it'll fail. The Constitution gives Congress this power specifically to check a president who's abused his authority. Using that power isn't politics, it's governance. It's the constitutional responsibility Congress has. But the Democratic leadership looks at this calculation differently. They remember what happened during Trump's first term when impeachment happened. They remember the political backlash. They remember that impeachment energized Trump's base more than it hurt him. They remember that it played into his narrative about being persecuted by Democrats. They remember that ultimately it didn't change anything. Trump was acquitted by the Senate and continued serving his full term. And they're worried that the same thing will happen again. That impeachment will fail. It'll backfire politically. It'll hurt Democrats in the 2026 elections. And for what? For a symbolic gesture that doesn't actually remove Trump. So you've got this split. You've got Thanedar filing articles, then getting pressure from leadership and backing off. You've got Green filing articles, then getting pressure from leadership, but refusing to back off because he's not as concerned about party discipline. You've got 500,000 people signing a petition. You've got advocacy groups organizing around this. You've got a fundamental disagreement about strategy and principle within the Democratic Party itself. And in the middle of all this, Republicans are pretty unified. They're not calling for Trump to resign. They're not calling for investigations. They're not splitting with him over this. They're defending him. They're attacking the Democrats for filing the articles. They're saying this is proof that Democrats will do anything to undermine Trump. It's a coordinated defense that basically says these charges are politics, don't take them seriously, and we're sticking with Trump no matter what. What's fascinating to me is watching how all these different actors are playing the long game here. Democrats who file impeachment articles know they won't succeed now, but they're creating a record. They're building a foundation for future action if the political situation changes. They're shifting the conversation. They're forcing people to engage with the actual charges, even if they ultimately reject them. Advocacy groups know impeachment won't work, but they're using it to build political pressure and get people mobilized. Republicans know these impeachment efforts will fail, but they're using them to turn Trump into a victim of Democratic overreach and energize their base. Everybody's playing for something bigger than just this moment. And this isn't just about whether Trump gets convicted and removed. It's about shaping the political narrative heading into the 2026 elections. It's about energizing bases on both sides. It's about setting precedents for what kind of presidential conduct we're willing to tolerate. It's about defining what authoritarianism looks like in America and whether we think we're seeing it. All of these are big, long-term strategic questions, and the impeachment efforts are part of that larger battle. What gets me, honestly, is that you've got serious people in serious positions making serious charges that the president has committed serious constitutional violations. You can agree or disagree with them, but you can't say they're not serious about it. Thanedar is a real congressman. Green's a real congressman with a track record of following through on this kind of thing. The Free Speech for People organization is a real legal advocacy group making constitutional arguments. These aren't random people on the internet. These are people with real authority and credibility making a formal case. And the Trump administration's response is basically to dismiss it all as politics. That might work with some people. It might work with his base. But for people who are actually paying attention to the substance, who are actually reading the charges, who are thinking about what the Constitution says, it's not a very compelling response. Now, let me tell you what I think is really going on here, because I want you to understand not just the facts, but the context. The panic we're seeing from Trump's side isn't really about whether impeachment will succeed. They know it won't. The panic is about something else entirely. It's about Trump's ability to dominate the narrative. It's about him potentially being vulnerable to something he can't control. It's about the possibility that Congress might actually use one of its constitutional powers to check him, even if that power ultimately doesn't remove him from office. Trump has spent his whole presidency, both terms, pushing boundaries. He's pushed on emergency powers. He's pushed on tariffs. He's pushed on government spending. He's pushed on attacks on the judiciary. He's pushed on retaliation against critics. He's done all this stuff knowing that it's controversial, knowing that courts would probably rule against some of it, knowing that Congress might not like it. But he's calculated that as long as his party controls Congress, he can get away with it. Republicans won't vote to impeach him. Republicans won't vote to convict him. So he's basically untouchable. But here's the thing that's changing. The number of people willing to challenge that calculation is growing. It started with Thanedar in April. Then Green came along. Then there's talk about more articles coming before Christmas. That's a pattern. That's momentum. And the Trump administration knows that if this pattern continues, if more and more Democrats file articles, if the pressure builds, if voters start caring about it more, it creates a political environment where it becomes harder to ignore. It becomes harder to just dismiss as politics. It becomes something real. And here's what would really panic them. If the 2026 elections happened and Democrats took back the House, because then all these articles that were filed, all these charges that were documented, all these formal allegations, they become the basis for actual impeachment proceedings with a real chance of passing and putting pressure on the Senate. That's the nightmare scenario for Trump's people. That's why they're defensive about it. That's why they're so aggressive in dismissing it, because they know that impeachment, even if it fails now, could have real teeth later if the political situation changes. So what we're really watching is a constitutional struggle. It's a struggle over whether there are real limits on presidential power or whether a president with a party that controls Congress is basically untouchable. It's a struggle over whether the Constitution's checks on presidential power actually work, or whether they've been rendered meaningless by partisan divisions. It's a struggle over what democracy actually means in America in 2025. And the impeachment efforts are part of that larger struggle. They're not the whole thing. They're not even necessarily the most important thing, but they're part of it. What I hope people understand from this is that the Constitution isn't self-executing. It's not magic. It requires people to actually use it. It requires Congress to actually exercise its power. It requires citizens to care enough to demand that their representatives use that power. When people stop using it, when people stop demanding that it be used, then the Constitution becomes just a piece of paper. But when people do use it, when they do demand action, then it becomes something real and powerful. And that's what we're seeing happen right now. People demanding that Congress use its impeachment power. People demanding that the Constitution be respected. People refusing to just accept that one person can consolidate all the power. That's democracy. That's how it's supposed to work. Does it feel broken sometimes? Yeah, it does. It feels broken a lot. We've got a system where a president might commit constitutional violations and still not get removed from office because the other party controls Congress. That's a real vulnerability in our system. That's a real problem. But the fact that people are trying to use the tools available to them, the fact that people are filing impeachment articles even knowing they probably won't succeed, the fact that people are willing to go on record saying the president is unfit, that matters. That's the system trying to correct itself. That's democracy trying to work. All right, my friend, that's what's going on with the impeachment situation. That's why Trump's people are panicking, even though they know impeachment probably won't pass. They know that these articles, once filed, once public, once in the record, they change something fundamental about how people view this presidency. They create a narrative where Trump's the guy Congress had to impeach. They force Republicans to defend his actions. They put pressure on the system to do something about presidential conduct that critics say violates the Constitution. And that pressure, that narrative, that record, that all matters, even if impeachment doesn't succeed in actually removing him from office. So pay attention to this stuff. Don't just accept what people tell you about it. Read the actual articles. Understand the charges. Think about what they mean. Think about what kind of democracy you want to live in. Think about whether there should be limits on presidential power. These aren't abstract questions anymore. They're real questions being fought out in real time in Congress. And your voice, your attention, your understanding of what's actually happening, that matters. That's what changes things. That's what makes democracy work. Thanks for being here with me. Thanks for paying attention. Thanks for caring about this stuff. That's what it's all about. I'll be back soon with more episodes of The Future in View. Keep watching. Keep thinking. Keep demanding better from your government. That's all we can do. That's all we need to do. Take care, my friend. Happy holidays. Be well.